Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm Chris Paxson. I'm president of Brown. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the second event of this year in our Reaffirming University Values series that Provost Rick Locke and I host for the second year. We started this last year. And the series has a very special purpose. What we're aiming to do is to empower the Brown community to model the ways that we can have open, honest, intellectually grounded conversations that prepare us all to listen and navigate in a pluralistic society. Previous lectures in this series have given us much to reflect on during what I think we can all agree is a very difficult and polarizing time in the country. And I hope that they've provided us with a deeper understanding of how, in a practical sense, our values as a university guide us in what we do and how we learn, which is maybe the most important part. So over the last year, we've discussed issues like unsafe spaces of democracy and free speech and science denial. I'm looking at Ken Miller, who gave that lecture. Islamophobia, and last month we had a really terrific faculty panel on white nationalism in the context of events at Charlottesville, Virginia. So today we're going to consider identity politics with our guest lecturer, Professor of Humanities at Columbia University, Mark Lilla, and two Brown faculty discussants. So before I do introductions, I just want to say a few very brief words that are thoughts on setting the table for tonight's talk, which is on after identity liberalism. Professor Lilla is the author of probably one of the most provocative and talked about op-eds of the past year, The End of Identity Liberalism, which ran in the New York Times in November, is that right? Yeah, I thought it was later than that, but last November, so almost a year. And in this piece, Professor Lilla suggested that America's diversity, while an extraordinary achievement and a national asset, has prompted positive social change, but maybe is failing at the level of electoral politics. And in his view, maybe he can disagree with my paraphrasing of his view, it was identity liberalism that fractured the left and delivered the unexpected outcome of the 2016 US presidential election. And his argument is that what we share as citizens and not our status as members of different groups, identity groups that build solidarity, and expending energy on the latter, we miss maybe strategic opportunities to form common goals across identities. His thesis that our broad focus on identity has, quote, and this is a direct quote, produced a generation of liberals and progressives who are unaware of conditions outside their self-defined group, really got people's attention in a very big way. And the ensuing debate has been extended further in his recent book, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. And the debate, I think, on these topics has been very spirited. Now, I'm not going to summarize the key aspects of the debate. I think our speaker, our discussants, and some of the Q&A that we get from the audience will be the most informative. But I think it is important that this work has sparked just a really important conversation. And it's helped us think about how we construct our identities, how our unique life experiences and personal histories come to define who we are, and how this bears on our values, what we care about, the world we live in, and how we relate to each other. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Mark Lilla, intellectual historian, essayist, scholar, and educator, to share his views with us at Brown. So let me just say a few words about him, and then I'll turn to the discussants. Among the highlights of Professor Lilla's distinguished career are professorships at NYU and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He's now at Columbia University, as I said. He's a regular essayist for the New York Review of Books and other publications. He specializes in intellectual history with a particular focus on Western political and religious thought. Among his books are The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction, The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics in the Modern West, and G.B. Vico, The Making of an Anti-Modern, in addition to the book that I already noted. So I'm going to introduce our discussants right now so that when they come up, I don't have to jump up and do it again. I'll do it all at once. And in alphabetical order and in order of speaking, the first is Professor Charles Larmore, who is the W. Duncan MacMillan Family Professor in the Humanities in the Department of Philosophy at Brown. He is noted for his writings on political liberalism, the nature of the self, and the nature of moral judgment. Charles is a scholar in the history of philosophy from the 16th to the 20th century, with particular interest in German idealism in the work of Kant, Nietzsche, Descartes, Sartre, and others. He's a contributor to Brown's Political Theory Project, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the Presidential Faculty Award at Brown, and I suspect his work on reflection and human agency will be top of mind during today's discussion. Professor Prerna Singh, our other discussant, is the Mahatma Gandhi Assistant Professor of Politics and International Studies at the Center for Contemporary South Asia at the Watson Institute. Beyond her research on comparative politics, the political economy of development, social welfare, and the politics of South Asia and East Asia, Professor Singh also examines identity politics, particularly the causes and consequences of ethnic and national identifications. Among the many books she has authored, her first book, How Solidarity Works for Welfare, was awarded the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Prize for the best book on government politics or international affairs from the American Political Science Association. So please join me in welcoming the three of them. Just to set the ground rules, we've asked Professor Lilla to speak for about 30 minutes, and then each of the discussants to come in for maybe 10, 12 minutes, something like that, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So please, Professor Lilla, come on up. Thank you.
You hear me all right? Yeah. Good, okay. Before I discuss anything tonight, I want to make something clear. And that is that my remarks are partisan. I am a liberal speaking to or addressing myself to fellow liberals. And tonight I'll use the word liberal as a catch-all phrase for anyone left of center all the way over to progressives and beyond. Because our universities are dominated by liberals and liberal ideas, we sometimes forget that there are other points of view, and we speak of politics in the classroom and elsewhere in a way that presumes that all moral, right-thinking people agree with us. We don't even perceive how partisan we are, and therefore have trouble understanding why many Americans find us smug. So, to the conservative students in the audience, and if there is one, conservative professors in the audience, welcome. If there's one thing that I've learned in discussing or trying to discuss what we call identity politics, it's this. You had better begin with politics. Because once Americans start arguing and shouting and beating their chests about identity, they never get to politics. So let me start by making something clear. The Once and Future Liberal is a book about politics. It has nothing to say about the metaphysics of personal or group identity. It does not present a moral balance sheet on American history. Neither does it rain God's judgment down on the country for its sins. There are plenty of books out there that do that. This is not one of them. The Once and Future Liberal is about politics, and therefore about power. In the book, I sketch a history recounting how a once vibrant liberal tradition lost its hold on the American imagination. I then draw some lessons from that history, and I conclude by offering some tentative suggestions, very tentative, about what we might do differently to regain power and accomplish the things that we profess to want. And that's all my book sets out to do. Though if you spend your life on Twitter, you'd never know that. Tonight, though, given the time constraints, I've decided not to summarize my book for you, but try something else. Instead, I want to lay bare the underlying structure of the argument underlying it. And in doing it this way, hopefully, I can deflate some of the hysteria surrounding the book. The Once and Future Liberal rests on a premise, and from this premise, I draw certain conclusions. Now, there may be very good reasons to reject my premise or to modify it, or you might feel that even given my premise, I have drawn the wrong conclusions from it. And I welcome that kind of debate, because that's the kind of debate that I can learn something from. My premise is the following: that you cannot help anyone in American politics over the long term unless you maintain a durable hold on institutional power. And by institutional power, I mean holding public offices responsible for making and enforcing the law. Of course, institutional politics is not the only way to practice politics. There's movement politics. And there was a time in our recent history, not so long ago, I'd say from the late 50s up until around the early 80s, when social movements were the only thing making the American system budge. There were issue-based movements like those against the Vietnam War or to protect the environment. And there were what we call now identity-based ones for the rights of African Americans and other ethnic minorities, for women and for gays. And it can't be denied that thanks to these latter movements, the country is a more tolerant, more just, and more inclusive place than it was 50 years ago. I know, because sad to say, I was there. But that period is over. And in fact, it's been over for decades. The truth is that since the Reagan years, the overall balance of political power in the United States has not been greatly affected by social movements. Movements have continued to make advances on particular issues, gay marriage, for example. And our culture, just the way we deal with each other, even how businesses operate, those things have been transformed by social movements. There's no doubt about that. And it's something that conservatives complain about bitterly. But for more than 3 decades now, changes in the structure of political power, in the sense I mean it, in this country, have been determined almost wholly by the gains and losses of our 2 major political parties. And there is a deep lesson in this. It is that in America, institutional politics can always, at some point, undo whatever gains are made through movement politics. This is an inconvenient truth that movement activists would prefer to ignore. But it's hard to ignore if you're actually paying attention to politics across the country, and not just in Washington, D.C., and certainly not just on campuses. If you look at the states where Republicans hold undisputed power today, you will see what happens to movement gains in the face of institutional power. Thanks to the women's movement, women have a constitutional right to get an abortion. That was an achievement. But in large swaths of the country, Republican legislatures are erecting spurious barriers to getting one, so that de facto, women living in certain places cannot exercise their constitutional right. In some Republican states, the equal voting rights of African Americans, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement 50 years ago, are steadily being eroded through gerrymandering and the manipulation of voting hours. And in other states, progressive gay rights legislation passed at the local level is being overturned by Republican legislatures and governors. Liberals have had only 2 Democratic presidents since the Reagan era. But the truth of their administrations is that they were stymied at almost every turn by rabidly right-wing Republicans in Congress and in state offices, not to mention the Supreme Court. And this situation is only getting worse. Today, Republicans hold 2/3 of the state houses in this country, and 2/3 of the state legislatures. They control 24 out of 50 states outright. Democrats control only 7. And radical right billionaires like the Koch brothers are pouring money today into state races. That for them, this is the new frontier. And as a result, unions and public schools are now under severe attack. And if Republicans gain 1 or 2 more state legislatures, they could conceivably call a constitutional convention. Now just think for a minute about what that would mean, a constitutional convention in the age of Donald Trump for the rights of African Americans, women, and gays. It's no longer time to talk about making future gains. We live in an age of rollback, and that's what needs to be focused on. That means that the greatest proximate threat to the gains made by social movements over the past 50 years is not white supremacy or sexism or homophobia any more than it is the fall in the Garden of Eden. The present danger is a hyper-radical and institutionally powerful Republican Party, and they acquired their party through their power through electoral politics, not movement politics. So that's my premise. The primacy of institutional politics over movement politics, not always, but at this moment in our history. And if you accept this premise, I think 2 conclusions follow. The first is that liberal political strategy must be adapted to the peculiar institutions we have in this country. We only have 2 effective political parties. We have the separation of powers into different governmental branches. And we have a federal system that reserves significant power to states and localities. Consequently, the main focus of our energies must be on those particular institutions, strengthening the Democratic Party, winning congressional elections, especially in swing states, and winning state and local races across the country. We liberals have a problem, though. To be a credible competitor in all these races, we need to be present everywhere. We need to be a widespread grassroots party, which is what the Republican Party has been since the 80s, and the Democrat Party has not been. After the Reagan Revolution, Republicans went out seducing voters in small and medium-sized towns across America, setting up party offices, visiting church and VFW halls and small-town parades, while liberals retreated to the 2 coasts, into the womb of the university, and into the media establishment, into an elite club where contempt for flyover America is considered a sign of good breeding. The second conclusion I draw from my premise is this. If you aim to regain institutional power by winning elections in every part of the country, then your party's message must play in every part of the country as a whole. Sorry, I should have printed this differently. But how is that possible, to have one message that addresses the country as a whole? I'm asked this constantly by fellow liberals. They say the country's now made up of diverse groups, and now they're hostile groups. This dogma about diversity is, I'm afraid, a large part of the problem. If, when you look at America, you see nothing but a collection of groups defined by their identities, and if you assume that is what motivates everyone in politics, if you assume that there's no shared experience in this country, no democratic we, then you will be inclined to give up on certain people and places, and to think of campaigning as an exercise in targeting. First, you construct a list of groups, then you make a list of policies, and then you go out on the stump connecting groups with policies, speaking differently in different places about that connection. And this is exactly what makes Democratic candidates, with a few exceptions, seem wholly inauthentic to those not already convinced. Voters know when they're being targeted. What they don't know is what the candidate and the party fundamentally stand for. From the time of Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, voters knew what Republicans fundamentally stood for. Even we as liberals did. And that's because what the party inherited from Ronald Reagan was not a list of policies, or a list of identity groups, or a list of target groups. What it inherited from Reagan was a vision of the country. What it is, what it stands for, and what it might become. In a sense, what it means to be an American, though we know that's a very narrow sense of what it was. It was an anti-political vision, a picture of an America made up of individuals and families and churches who would magically flourish if only they were freed from the evil clutches of government. That certainly is not my vision. Prior to Reagan, of course, liberals had their own vision of the country, a political one, which they inherited from FDR and the New Deal. It portrayed the U.S. as a republic where citizens were joined in a collective enterprise to build a strong nation and protect each other through assertive government action. Whether they achieved it or not, what liberal Democrats stood for was clear to everyone: solidarity, opportunity, and public duty for all citizens. But during the Reagan years, that clarity was lost for all sorts of reasons having to do with what happened in the 60s and 70s in Vietnam and all the rest. Increasingly obsessed with group differences, liberals grew distrustful of the word we. They got out of the habit of addressing all citizens as citizens. Who's we? Which we? Which only left the impression that the Democrats were just an agglomeration of angry groups with different demands, without a vision of a common future that Americans might build together if Democrats were voted into office. Make no mistake about this. We is the most important word in the liberal and progressive lexicon. If there is no we, at least an aspirational one, then how can solidarity be built? How can people in one walk of life, or one region of the country, or one group, be inspired to make sacrifices for people in another? That's the magical thing you need to have happen. If we're only groups, why should they care? I hope you see what I'm driving at here. If all you see in the country is diversity, just different groups with distinct interests and different degrees of privilege and victimhood, you will be incapable of projecting a vision of the future. And if you have no such vision, you will never develop a message that can potentially reach people across the country. And if you fail to do that, then you lose elections. And I'm not talking about the presidency, we're too focused on that. Congressional and state and local elections. And the more elections you lose, the less you're able to help any of the identity groups that you say you care about. To state it somewhat paradoxically, the only way to gain institutional power to protect disadvantaged groups in America is to develop a vision and a message that do not focus single-mindedly on groups. You must make it clear to everyone that you are aiming for the country as a whole before you explain what that might mean for one group or region in the country. You enunciate the message, and then when you go around, you explain what that message, how that message applies for particular voters in particular places. But the message, the vision, remains the same. I've now spoken for 15 minutes, perhaps disappointing you, without mentioning identity politics once. And that was by design. Because what I've learned over the past year, ever since I published that New York Times article, is that the mere mention of the word identity causes Americans across the political spectrum to lose their minds. And once that happens, hard strategic thinking about political power screeches to a halt. Let me get a couple things out of the way. I think we all agree that there are many ways in which Americans do and must discuss race and gender. We need, for example, to explore the legacies of racism and sexism and homophobia if we want to fully understand our history and have a reckoning with our history. We also need to talk about race and gender in order to provide moral education to our children so they learn to avoid prejudices and stereotypes and discrimination. I personally think it's most important that we talk about race and gender when analyzing our many social problems. One cannot understand, to take the most obvious example, our criminal justice system and how it needs to be reformed if we don't focus on racial disparities in sentencing and many other things. And once we do that, then it becomes possible to actually mobilize people in these effective groups for power politics, institutional politics. So, if we agree on all this, what's my problem with identity politics? It's this: that over the past 3 decades, every advance of liberal identity consciousness has marked a retreat of liberal political consciousness. Politics, again, understood as the quest for institutional power. Moral posturing has replaced political calculation. And as political consciousness has waned, liberals have unlearned how to reach the country at large and win elections so they can benefit the very groups they care about. Now, you might object that there is no necessary reason why identity consciousness and political consciousness should be inversely related, and you're right. There's no necessary reason. But in America, they are, for reasons peculiar to ourselves. It is our Puritan heritage. Identity politics today is movement politics, and social movements tend to follow a certain trajectory. In party politics, the forces at work are basically centripetal. They encourage factions and interests to come together to work out common goals and strategy. In movement politics, the forces are centrifugal. They encourage splits into ever smaller factions, obsessed with single issues, and practicing ideological purification rituals. You rise to the head of the movement by being the most pure. And before long, the main enemies to be fought are not external enemies, but rather fellow movement members who are not, as we would say today, sufficiently woke. Over time, the rhetoric gets more heated and hyperbolic. So to keep motivated, movement members have to convince themselves that the sky's never been darker, that all seeming progress is an illusion, and that all but a trusted few are traitors to the cause. The Weather Underground in the United States, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Red Army faction in Germany, just a few examples from the 70s of the self-induced and self-defeating radicalization that has plagued left-wing movements throughout modern history. And that time again have provoked a reaction that tightened the right's hold on institutional power. Every country in Europe, and it's happening now in this country. In Europe, hysterical leftism tends to end in violence directed at the state. In the US, it usually ends in an evangelical crusade. The civil rights movement and the early women's and gay rights movement were actually quite savvy political endeavors. They sought power and were strategically self-aware. They did not reject the aspiration to forge a great democratic we. Rather, they claimed that they had been excluded from that we and now deserved to be fully enfranchised as citizens and as equal members of civil society. Their demands were strong and strongly put, but they were also veiled invitations to all Americans to join in a common effort to guarantee the rights of citizens and to build a country together. Not so today's identity politics, which has become a pseudo-politics of the self projected onto society at large. Most of you are too young to know, but there was a time when we talked about racial and gender justice in America without invoking the word identity at all. The word identity did not really enter the American lexicon until the 50s, when a German emigre psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson announced to Americans that you all have identities and they're all in crisis. And suddenly everyone was convinced they had an identity crisis. And then the word migrated, there are books about this, the word migrated into politics in the early 70s. But even then, identity, in the early 70s, identity was thought as a social category, something that was imposed by society in order to set up artificial distinctions. No longer. Today, by identity, we mean something internal, a kind of inner homunculus that's uniquely my own, a mix of freely chosen sub-identities, a fragile little thing that needs tending to. If you believe that, it's little wonder then that for liberal identitarians, political issues immediately get transformed into intimate issues. A challenge to my political position is felt if you think that politics is all about identity. An attack on your political position seems to be an attack on your self-definition and subjective experience. And who are you to challenge that? That's what's happening, I think, on our campuses. And what happens then is that argument is replaced by taboo, because we can't talk, we can't presume to know anything about each other's intimate selves. At times, our more privileged campuses, whipped up in an identity frenzy, can seem stuck in the world of archaic religion. Only those with approved identity status are, like shamans, allowed to speak on certain matters. Scapegoats are denounced and run off campus in a purging ritual. Propositions become pure or impure, not true or false. And not only propositions, but simple words. And not only simple words, pronouns. So what becomes then of intellectual and political interaction on campus? It begins to disappear. Or it is replaced by lame appeals to an ephemeral and ever-shifting intersectionality which commits no one to anything in the long term. Intersectionality is not solidarity. Political engagement out in the risky world gives way to proselytizing and denunciation safely from behind a laptop. I no longer want to beat my adversary in argument and then beat my adversary at the polls. Or I don't want to simply persuade that person to join my side. What I want to do is express myself and demand from everyone else a confession of sins and a profession of faith. This is typically American. You don't find this kind of fanaticism on any left in the world, though it's starting in Britain and a little bit in Germany, Protestant countries both. Americans don't want a revolution and never have. They don't want to talk about class. Instead, Americans want a great awakening. Hence the omnipresent use of the term woke, which comes from Protestant American theology. Every so often, surges of fevered fanaticism come over America in our political life and in our religious life. We lose all sense of proportion, and everything seems to be of unbearable moral urgency. That's why, truth be told, we are not having a national conversation about race and gender today. It feels more like being stuck in a revivalist tent where all are expected to approach the altar, convert, and start speaking in a new tongue. Hallelujah. The problem is this. Identitarian evangelism is about speaking truth to power. I accept that. But politics is about becoming the power. If you don't want that, if you don't want to become the power, if that's not your ultimate goal, if you're not willing to sacrifice and swallow a little bit of yourself to gain power to actually do something, then you are simply not a political person. Don't kid yourself. Well, as what I've just said will bear out, I too am on an evangelical crusade. But my aim is not to make you confess your sins or change your politics. Instead, I want to encourage you to change your thinking and your tactics to reach your own ends, to be less moralistic and more ruthlessly strategic, to become more political than you actually are, not less political. Students have tremendous energy, and it's visible now in the efforts to resist Donald Trump. But that energy must be redirected if you are to become the change you say you seek. In the last chapter of my book, I developed some very sketchy thoughts about, or put forward, I don't even develop them, some thoughts about what such a reorientation might mean. So let me conclude by mentioning a couple. First, and most important, escape the trap of your self-defined identity. Get over it and discover the political world outside your head. Not that you shouldn't be interested in issues connected to groups you belong, but I mean get away from your self-definition. Learn what matters out in the world right now, not just to you personally. Race and gender are not the only issues that matter in America today. And if that's all you can talk about, you're not going to reach many people, not by a long shot. The question of class, for example, looms over everything. And let's say you wanted to understand class in America. Well, then you would have to steep yourself in history, philosophy, and economics, which I encourage you to study. And you would have to avoid, like the plague, all bullshit theory classes. Second, discover America. I think that if I offered any of you in the room right now, students, a chance to deliver disaster relief in Somalia or go work on women's issues in Pakistan, you'd jump at the chance, and that speaks very well of you. Tonight I'm asking you to do something much harder for you. I'm asking you to go to a swing state in Middle America for a summer. Spend some time in places where the Wi-Fi sucks, where you have no desire to post a picture of your dinner on Instagram, and where people have their heads bowed in prayer in thanks for that dinner. Take a big humility pill and get to know them. Visit their churches and their homes. And while you're visiting, work on winning back for the Democratic Party one seat, just one seat in the state legislature or Congress. That would be an enormous contribution to seizing power and becoming the power again. Next, descend from the pulpit with your adversaries. Accept what's obvious to almost everyone in America, that we've made incredible progress on race and gender issues of the past half century. But use that progress as motivation to continue the work. and use it to persuade others to join you. Remind yourself that no one has ever, in the history of the human race, been motivated to do good by being hectored about their failings, any more than you were ever motivated by the hectoring of your parents. Remember that no one has ever gained power in any country in the world by denouncing that country. Take a look at the history of the McGovern race in 1972. Finally, and I'll conclude, stay focused and hungry. Don't get distracted by campus trivia and the exaggerated sensitivities of privileged fellow students. And if you're in this room, you're privileged. And by those teachers and college administrators who make a living heightening your sensitivities. Your adversary is not the unwitting person who uses the wrong word, and certainly not one who has a different opinion. Your adversary is the radicalized Republican Party that's doing real damage out there in the real world, beyond the gates of this campus. Avoid the traps set by the right-wing media. Don't become fodder for Fox News. The whole country is watching your every move. Wake up every morning wanting to ruin Steve Bannon's day. If that isn't motivation, I don't know what is. And welcome to the NFL. Thank you.
Thank you. So Charles, come on up. Thanks.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and in particular, a pleasure to debate my old friend, Mark Lilla, about his book, which I, in many respects, quite admire. The main object of Mark Lilla's critique, as we've heard, is the identity politics he believes has taken over the Democratic Party and played a major role in the Democrats' catastrophic losses in the 2016 election. By identity politics, he means a politics focused on the particular ethnic, racial, and gender identities with which many people may align themselves, and in terms of which they may feel unjustly treated in the society. The Democratic Party, Mark believes, is becoming increasingly something like a coalition of minorities, plus an intellectual elite that sympathizes with their plight. This strategy, he complains, has allowed the adversary, namely the Republican Party, to present itself as the party committed not to special fractional interests, but instead to the common good. The result is the debacle we saw last November. As Mark indicated in an interview with The New Yorker, he agrees on this point, I presume it's the only point, with Steve Bannon, who has said, I quote Bannon now, "The Democrats, the longer they talk about identity politics, I've got them. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity, and we go with economic nationalism, we can crush the Democrats." So much for Bannon. What the Democratic Party must instead do, Mark argues, is articulate a common vision of what it is to be an American, one that transcends various group identities, and then, on this basis, appealing to things that all Americans share, defend and enhance the rights of minorities, among, indeed, other political objectives. I want to mention quickly two reservations I have about Mark's diagnosis as so far described. Quickly, not because I regard them as insignificant, but because there are other points I want to discuss more. First, it is, in my view, undeniable that the Republican Party, too, and not just the Trump-Bannon faction, has been practicing identity politics, even if in coded dog whistle form, as it presents itself, in effect, as a defender of the interests of aggrieved whites who feel they are becoming, as indeed they are, a minority in the United States. And second, I think it is an overgeneralization to say that identity politics has taken over the Democratic Party, since many of its leaders have championed justice and equal rights for various minorities precisely on the grounds that these are American values guaranteed by the Constitution. But let us look somewhat further at Mark Lilla's picture of the floundering of the present-day Democratic Party. As people of the left come more and more to identify themselves with their particular cultural identities, instead of thinking of themselves first and foremost as American citizens, they become more interested in political movements that claim to represent their particular identities than in the nitty-gritty of winning elections and passing legislation, which must always involve compromise with people of different persuasions. The distinction between movement politics and institutional politics is an essential one for Mark. It's the difference between demonstrations, strikes, protests, marches, and petitions on the one hand, and winning elections, holding offices, and doing deals to pass legislation on the other. It underlies one fundamental axiom of his position, to which he alluded in his talk today, in which in his book he calls an iron law in democracies. And I'm quoting him here. From the book, since anything achieved through movement politics can be undone through institutional politics, we should recognize, still a quote, the priority of institutional over movement politics. The ultimate failure of identity politics stems from the fact, and again I'm quoting Mark, that, quote, movement politics began to be seen as an alternative rather than as a supplement to institutional politics. I disagree. Without denying the dangers of an exclusive concern with particular identities, I do not think that movement politics should be seen either as an alternative or as a supplement to institutional politics. Rather, the two are equally necessary. Yes, institutional politics, a new party in office, can often undo the achievements of movement politics, and political movements will come to naught if they do not succeed in scoring institutional victories. But let's not forget that movement politics does indeed achieve important things that would otherwise simply not have happened, and that an institutional politics that is not forced to respond to political movements easily begins to look only after itself and to turn a blind eye to existing forms of injustice. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Lyndon Johnson played essential roles in advancing the civil rights of African Americans. Indeed, the interplay between these two kinds of politics has been for centuries a central ingredient in the development of social justice in America. One need only go earlier than the 20th century, which Mark was focusing on in this talk, you only think of the abolitionist movement and the election of Lincoln in the mid-19th century, or of the labor movement and progressive legislation at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. As I've said, I agree with Mark's complaints about an exclusive concern with identity politics. But let's examine now the remedy he proposes. His view is that the party of the left, the Democratic Party, needs to appeal to people not in terms of the separate identities they may possess or espouse, but rather in the name of what all Americans share. That, he claims, can only be their common citizenship. At least that's what he claims in his book. Now, this idea of citizenship seems to me rather vague. It might mean simply the legal status of having certain rights, duties, and benefits, a status that, as we know today, people living in a country without it or living elsewhere may desperately want to achieve. But it's precisely the significance of that status, the values and ideals it supposedly embodies, and not the status just by itself, that citizenship must be understood to mean if it is to serve as a political rallying cry. Moreover, these values and ideals will have to be ones which at some level of generality, even if there are differences of interpretation, all Americans supposedly endorse. And I would add, they must also be values and ideals by which Americans can distinguish themselves from other peoples, so they can find pride and purpose, not merely in being citizens of a modern liberal democracy, which Canada, Britain, Germany, and others are as well, but in being American citizens. For the aim is to bring about a more just society by refashioning our sense of a common destiny, term often used by Mark in his book, that binds us together as a people. Mark himself, in the book anyway, ventures no account of what these shared values and ideals are. Perhaps he thinks this is something that must be worked out in the give and take of democratic discussion. Yet I have serious doubts about whether there is any longer much of an American we to be retrieved and steered in the direction of goals that liberals would want to pursue. In general, the fact that something is desirable is no reason to think it exists. Let me be clear about the nature of my criticism. I'm not faulting Mark for failing to offer a concrete prescription for the weakness of the left in this country. I have none to offer myself. But analysis must precede prescription, as I'm sure Mark would agree. And the analysis I'm going to sketch will suggest that a sense of the Americanness that all Americans can share and regard as the meaning of their common citizenship is today, if indeed it ever existed for all Americans in the past, a thing of the past. No doubt the dominant conception of what is distinctive and valuable about being an American citizen has been the idea of American exceptionalism. It's the idea of America as different from all other countries in virtue of having consciously broken with the tyrannies of the past and of founding itself as a new beginning, that's the Novus Ordo Seclorum on your $1 bill, on a commitment to the principles of liberty and equality for all, and on the promise that with hard work, every American has the opportunity to better his or her condition. America is, as the phrases go, a city upon the hill, the last hope of Earth. Can this idea still move us and form the basis of a liberal democratic program for the future? I doubt it. Though many of us may still profess allegiance to the idea of American exceptionalism, the knowing part of ourselves has come to realize that it was always a myth. First of all, America was founded not just on certain ideas, but on what we today call crimes against humanity, namely genocide and slavery. These are not merely evils that happened to accompany the creation of the American Republic. There would have been no American Republic without them. They were essential preconditions. America is not exceptional. It's not, of course, worse than other countries, but it is not better than many either. And second, most of us also know, when we reflect and do not parrot pieties, that it is not true that every American has the opportunity through hard work to better their condition. Many Americans are the object of systematic discrimination, and those who are born in economically depressed circumstances have, as a rule, far less opportunity than others, if any, however hard they work, to do better than their parents. And in addition to living at a time in which the American myth is dissipating, we also live today in a society ruled by the new digital media, by Facebook, the internet, cable news, and talk radio. That's just a partial list. I should add Twitter, in which Americans increasingly inhabit, for much of the time, worlds of their own choosing, in which they only encounter views of the sort they already have. Plenty of psychological research shows that when like-minded people discuss only among themselves, their shared views move away more and more from the views of other groups of people. The chances, therefore, of any common vision of what it means to be an American and of what path American society should take are, I believe, becoming increasingly small. I do not know myself what can be done when older visions of what it is to be an American are seen to be myths, and newer visions, such as suggested, become more and more difficult to work out. I do know that appeals to citizenship as such do nothing. And I also know, quite generally, that everything ends or dies. Not just individuals, but republics too. America is not exceptional in this regard either.
So first of all, thank you to Professor Lilla for this timely and thought-provoking talk, and to President Paxson for giving me an opportunity to respond to it. So I want to begin by briefly summarizing Professor Lilla's argument as I understood it. So the only way to bring meaningful change in American politics is through institutional power. The route to institutional power is by winning elections. And the way to win elections is through a common vision that speaks to all citizens as citizens. The way not to win elections is through narrow, sectional, increasingly fanatical visions that are articulated through identity politics. It's an elegantly structured argument about a deep political predicament that the US faces today, and there's much in this argument that I'm deeply sympathetic to. So as a political scientist, I will be betraying my tribe if I don't wholeheartedly endorse both the centrality of institutional power for bringing about change and electoral victories as a vehicle for gaining institutional power. As a scholar of political communities, as someone who studies social solidarity and has recently published a book on the power of we-ness, I'm completely sympathetic to the necessity and indeed the power, again, of the unifying vision that Professor Lilla is urging American liberals towards. Yet, and here I echo Charles's points, what is this vision that is going to bring Americans together? As I mentioned, I think a lot about this sense of us, of how historically in different places at different points in time, ideas of we-ness have been constructed. And so I was curious when I read Professor Lilla's book to read what he had in mind. And we hear a lot through this book about what this vision is not. And what it's not is the movement politics of identity. It's not a turn towards the self. It's not I'm here, I'm queer. And that is elegantly presented and extremely clear throughout the book. We also hear about how we're going to get to this vision, or perhaps this is how we're going to spread it. I was a little bit unclear. But the process, as again Professor Lilla said in his remarks today, is to descend. We need to learn to listen. We need to imagine. We need to visit, if only with our mind's eye, places where the Wi-Fi is crap, the coffee is weak, and we don't post pictures of our dinner on Instagram. So we know what this vision is not. We know how we will get to and spread this vision, but what is this vision? We only really begin to hear in this book about page 120. I flagged it. So, and I quote now from Professor Lilla, the only way out of this conundrum is to appeal to something that as Americans we all share, but which has nothing to do with our identity, without denying the existence and importance of the latter. And there is something, if only liberals would again begin to speak of it, and that is citizenship. And Professor Lilla immediately admits that citizenship is an unusual choice. I quote from him again. He says that the word citizen has a very musty air. It brings up this image for people of a certain age or people who lived in a different country as I did, of school teachers tapping blackboards with wooden pointers during civics class. But citizenship, Professor Lilla insists, has great potential, and that's because it is a political status, nothing less and nothing more. I quote from him again. So here then is where I began to struggle. Meaningful change will come through elections that will not be won by divisive identity movements, but by transcending, though not abandoning, our identities in a unified vision at the heart of which is a political status, nothing less and nothing more. Now, this political status does a lot of work for Professor Lilla because, in a sense, the whole argument rests on it. It has to establish some sort of identification, and I'm quoting here, between the privileged and the disadvantaged. It has to induce a sense of duty. It has to provide a way of encouraging people to identify with one another. And I couldn't help but begin to wonder, can citizenship as a shared political status do all that? Does citizenship in America command the kind of affective attachment which is the necessary glue of all unifying visions? Does it move Americans? Can it, and I quote again, convince the well-off that they have a permanent duty to the worse-off? Can it encourage shared duties and obligations? Can it indeed, quote, provide Americans a way to talk about what they already share? So I have a confession, I'm not American, and neither am I a student of American politics. But as someone who has lived in and been an everyday observer of American politics for over a decade, I was a bit surprised by the singling out of citizenship as the rock upon which this edifice of a unifying solidarity, which I completely agree is necessary, should be built. Now, this surprise deepened when I put on my hat as a scholar of comparative politics, because historically we have very few cases in the world in which citizenship as a political status has been that shared glue of we-ness. That work has usually been done by a concept that is glaring in its absence in both Professor Lilla's book as well as his comments today, and that is nationalism. So you do not have an index for your book, Professor Lilla, which is fine because it isn't really meant to be read by the index-obsessed like me. But reading it, I was struck that many other isms figure very prominently. Liberalism, Marxism, socialism, even romanticism. But there's really no real discussion of nationalism. And yet, to speak as a political scientist for a second, that is the missing variable. Or now to resort to a colloquialism, the elephant in the room. Nationalism has historically provided a powerful unifying vision, fulfilling the very criteria that you set for a unifying vision, which is transcending identities without abandoning them. So post-war Europe is only one, albeit a very prominent example. Historian Linda Colley, for instance, has shown how the construction of an idea of Britain allowed the English, the Northern Irish, the Welsh, and the Scots not to abandon these identities, but to transcend them, to also identify with the subordinate identity of Britons. And this British identity, but not only a Spanish identity that sits above, for instance, the Basque, Catalan, and other regional identities, a Canadian identity that has sought to include Indigenous people, Francophones, and increasingly immigrants, they would all qualify as examples of attempts to create, quote, a solidarity that transcends identity attachments. But of course, Professor Lilla has thought about this. He made a deliberate decision. He chose not to identify nationalism as the basis on which Americans could come together. And I guess the question that I'm asking is why? Perhaps because nationalism enjoys a pretty bad rep. Chauvinism, xenophobia, conflict, discrimination, exclusion, these are only some of the many odious phenomena that it seems to bring in its wake. And I can see why Professor Lilla didn't perhaps want to rest the edifice of this coherent unifying vision that's going to rescue American liberalism, it's going to put the Democrats in power, it's going to give them the institutional authority to put in place long-lasting, meaningful change. Why would you want to rest something as grand as that on something as potentially unpalatable as nationalism? And Professor Lilla is certainly not the first and likely not the last liberal to be scared by nationalism. Citizenship just seems so much more respectable, so much safer, so much more dignified. But does it move? Does it motivate? Does it inspire? Does it, to use Professor Lilla's own words, appeal to Americans of every walk of life and inspire them to sacrifice? Isn't what does that, isn't what the real source of potential affective attachment in the US is nationalism, however fraught and contested it is? Isn't this perhaps what Professor Lilla really has in mind? Isn't that unifying vision nationalism and not citizenship? Let me say a little about why I think this. As I mentioned, we don't really hear much through the first 100+ pages of the book about what this thing is around which America is going to come together and win elections. But we hear a lot about what it's not, about what is preventing us from coming together and winning elections. And in fact, not so much the talk today, but the book is really about what is driving us apart. And what that is identity politics. But what is identity politics taking us away from? What is it stopping us from coming together around? Is it citizenship or is it nationalism? Is the problem with young people engaging in politics as an X? It's an example that Professor Lilla brings up in his book. He says, we all engage these days as X, as a person of color, as woman, as transgender. Is the problem that they're not engaging as citizens? Or are they not engaging as Americans? So in the book, Professor Lilla compares the homepage of the Democratic Party with the homepage of the Republican Party. And he lays out the problem that he has with the Democratic Party's webpage in some detail. He says it has a little link that clicks to people. And under that, it has messages for Hispanics, for the LGBT community, for Native Americans, for African Americans, for Asian Americans. And he thinks that's a problem. He does not say much about the Republican webpage, except that it prominently features a document entitled Principles for American Renewal. But herein then deepens the conundrum. The Republican Party does seem to have some kind of vision. And while Professor Lilla isn't really concerned about why the Republicans won, his focus is really on why the Democrats lost and how they can win again. Following the lines of his argument, as he did today in his oral remarks, the Republicans won because they were able to articulate a unifying vision. They did not play identity politics. And that unifying vision, as per the document that Professor Lilla himself highlights, is about American renewal. So Republicans won because they articulated a unifying vision around the idea of a nation, a vision of America, a vision of making America great again. And the Democrats lost because they played identity politics. They did not articulate such a vision. But that document on the homepage was not the only thing that the Republicans put out. And if we begin to look at that document, not in isolation or in comparison to the Democratic Party's homepage, but in the context, for instance, of what was said on the Republican presidential campaign trail, what begins to stare out at you is not what the document says, so much as what it doesn't say. The silence of the document on who is part of this American renewal, indeed on who is American, on whether those people that you criticize the Democratic Party, Professor Lilla, for explicitly addressing on their homepage, women, Hispanics, LGBT community, Native Americans, are they included as Americans? Or is the American nation white America? And isn't white nationalism also a form of identity politics? Or is identity politics only the politics of minorities, of blacks and queers, people of color and transgender? And identity politics of the dominant group is not identity politics, it's nationalism. So isn't to not talk explicitly about American nationalism, to give it up to the identity politics of the dominant group? Isn't instead the challenge to seize the idea of the nation, to reconstruct it, to fashion it as this we that will allow us to stand together? But herein is another stumbling block. By setting up identity politics and this unifying vision in opposition, Professor Lilla seems to be suggesting, perhaps even despite himself, that if we recognize identities, we undermine nationalism. Cohesiveness and inclusiveness of national identities are rendered mutually incompatible. We foreclose this idea of a hyphenated national identity. There is no Black American, queer American. And yet someone like the Canadian political theorist Will Kimlicker would argue that this is precisely how nations should be constructed today. His new work suggests that First Nation Canadian, Syrian Canadian, Greek Canadian, Chinese Canadian, these are not all just complementary with, but they are actually constitutive of Canadian nationalism. And there's a lot of empirical research on Spain, on India, that has shown that dual identifications strengthen and not undermine national identity. So rather than dissing political identity, isn't the real hard work to construct a vision of a unifying American national identity that includes these different identities and issues? But here Professor Lilla would say that his problem with contemporary identity politics is that they have no issues. Older social movements had issues. Contemporary social movements have these precious identities. And it's an interesting temporal distinction. The women's suffrage movement, civil rights, these were older issue-based movements. Women's marches, Black Lives Matters, these are precious contemporary, navel-gazing, inward-looking identity movements. But let's pause to think for a minute about this distinction. How do we know if a social movement is issue-based or identity-based? Might we not, at the time, have seen the suffragettes or civil rights activists marching in the street as women expressing their identity or blacks talking about their problems? Wouldn't we say to them, get over it? Do we deny contemporary social movements like women's marches or Black Lives Matter their issues only because we do not have the benefit of hindsight? And what is the cost of doing this? What is the cost of abandoning American nationalism to constructions of it in terms of the dominant identity and not fighting to reclaim it and reconstruct it inclusively? What is the cost of dismissing these movements as identity-based, of denying these movements their issues, and of not letting them influence our own agenda for change? I've engaged so far with Professor Lilla's idea of a unifying vision, and in conclusion, I just want to return to his overall goal, which, as I said at the beginning, I'm deeply sympathetic to and on board with. And the goal is to institute, and I quote, the changes we want and America needs. And this happens through institutional power. Institutional power happens through winning elections. Democrats win elections by abandoning identity politics and adopting a unifying vision that will allow them essentially, and I quote from Professor Lilla, to win back centrist working class voters in small-town middle America who have been put off by these narrow, personalized, navel-gazing, precious campus politics. But what if this working class to be won back is not centrist? What if it instead espouses ideas, a vision of the nation, you might say, that we find deeply exclusionary or unpalatable? How far are we willing to go to win them over? Professor Lilla makes an important point that coming together involves listening to other people's points of views, it involves concessions, it involves reaching out, and he says, and I quote, not everything is a matter of principle. And he gives his own example. He says, as he mentioned again today, that he's an absolutist on abortion. He says, and I quote, he believes that it should be safe and legal virtually without condition on every square inch of American soil. But not all Americans agree, and I'm still quoting from him, so what should my strategy be? Should I drive pro-life voters out of the garden and into the waiting arms of the radical right? Or should I find a way to make a few compromises in order to keep the liberal ones in my own party and voting with me on other issues? It's a very good question. But I couldn't help but wonder, when does a compromise, a concession, become a capitulation? Not everything is a matter of principle, but at what point in the reaching out do you lean so far that you tip over and forego the entire principle that you stand for? How many restrictions to abortion, I was wondering, Professor Lilla, are you willing to see imposed before your pro-choice principle begins to become so fuzzy that it is meaningless? In other words, at what points do the means violate the ends? At what point does the vision we need to espouse, the concessions we need to make to win elections, change our understanding of, quote, what America wants and needs? The last lines of Professor Lilla's book read, if you want to resist Donald Trump and everything he represents, this is where you must begin. But by the time I reached the end of the book, I couldn't help but wonder if Professor Lilla's route for effectively resisting Trump would turn us liberals into some version of Trump. If the only way to win elections is to espouse a unifying vision in which the identity politics of the dominant group is broadcast as American nationalism, and the voices of those who have been historically marginalized and excluded are to be silenced, then is that election worth winning? Is such an anthem worth singing? Shouldn't we rather kneel on one knee?
I want to thank all of the speakers. That was just, it was very interesting, terrific. Some people probably have to leave, so this is a good time if you're going to. The rest of us can stay for some discussion. Before we open it up, we only have 12 more minutes. So I was going to ask you if you wanted to respond, but we also really want to have questions from the floor. So what would you like to do?
You're my host, so you decide.
Are there any things that you're dying to respond to?
Oh.
Quickly.
Well, I mean, there are far too many threads here and important ones that both Prerna and Charles brought up. And I have answers for all of them. Almost. But I guess to make clear, the third part of the book is about where we go from here. I didn't want to write this part of the book because I wanted to write about a problem. But in America, you're expected to tie everything into a neat little bow and give your 5-point plan and put it under everyone's Christmas tree when you write a book about politics, not write a depressing European book that ends with a problem. When I said that what I offered was a sketch, I mean a sketch. And, my task in the book as I saw it was to try to get the ocean liner redirected a little bit, right? And say, here's a direction you might want to go in. Start thinking about what we all share, one of the reasons being that it will distract people from the things that differentiate them. So they're psychologically more focused on common problems so they can establish a working relationship, and then we can cope with things a little better, I would think. Because the question I pose to myself is, what vocabulary can we employ in order to convince a guy who runs a real estate company in Mississippi that his destiny is connected to the life of a single mother in the south side of Chicago? How do you induce that feeling in someone? Now, that feeling was in America for a rare period in our history, and even then it didn't extend far enough. But there was a feeling that we had a common experience with the Great Depression and the Second World War that created a sense that we have common problems and we have a stake in each other's well-being, right? And then that disappeared for reasons I talk about in the book. Now, it used to be that the Bible taught that you had to take care of your neighbor. Well, the Bible doesn't teach that anymore. The Bible teaches that you have to get successful and rich, and that will prove that you've been saved. And abortion's the most important thing, so vote for any maniac for president who promises to change the Supreme Court. Charity is not mentioned. Charity is left up to the discretion of the customer. So how do we even start to try to make an appeal? Is it enough? No, it's not enough. Things are never enough. Can it replace national feeling? I don't know. to my mind, by process of exclusion, the only tool I have to grip someone else, those two people I mentioned, is to say that, God damn it, you belong to the same country. You owe it to each other by virtue of being a citizen. I don't have to pack a lot into what that citizenship is. We can also leave it open for debate. What do we owe each other? What I worry about is that we can't even begin a conversation because people don't feel they owe things to each other. And I talk in the book about how we got to that point, and I think we have gotten to that point now. So, to speak sort of university speak, I want to start a national conversation about citizenship, right? But something has to be done to get us to think about what we owe each other. Now, what gets packed into that? Where our differences of background and gender and race and ethnicity fit into that is something we talk about and negotiate. And there are ways in which, you can have this dual sense of attachment. And I say that in the book. Yes. Your citizenship relation to everyone else lays on top of your other relations you have to other people in your groups. I'm just trying to say we can we've got to try to put a thread through these so people see what we share. Because, in fact, there is a we in this country because we suffer the same problems. There is no identity dimension to global warming. We all have a stake in having an economy that works properly. We all have a stake in having an educated and healthy workforce and children who learn things for the future in school. Those are common problems. And if they're common, that means there's a we that's experiencing this and has to do something. I don't have to go deep into everything about you to know that. There is a common good on certain particular issues. And what I'm interested in is finding a way to reach out to people. Now, someone's sympathy, you see, and I'll stop here, and this is just a vague thought on my part, is that if I ask this real estate guy in Mississippi who goes to an evangelical church and is convinced that everyone wants to change the gender of his kids and that abortion is the biggest threat in America and everyone's taking money from him, in terms of education, what I'd want to do is to get him to walk a mile in the shoes of the woman in the south side of Chicago. That's the job for schools and churches, right? Television does it a little bit. And we don't do enough of it. But I'm searching for something else, and maybe there is nothing else left. There is nothing else left. I'm searching for a way to say that, to convince both of those people that we share things together, we have a duty to each other, a word that doesn't appear at all in any political discourse today, duty. Yeah? And that by focusing on the country and our history of pulling together and helping each other, I can maybe budge that real estate guy just a little bit.
Okay.
And politics about that.
Thank you. So we have 2 microphones here. People can come down and ask questions. So please get up and come down and if you want to ask something. And we'll go back and forth each side. So we'll start right here. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Arish. I'm a senior concentrating in development studies and public policy. And I want to start with that notion of duty that you just left off on because the first thing that I thought of was Assata Shakur's chant. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And I think that's one of the most powerful calls to solidarity that has ever been uttered. I think that a lot of the organizers who I've met on the ground who are doing movement power, movement politics-based work are uniting around losing chains, are uniting around the differences that their identities lead to in outcomes of health and class, but with the common understanding that we all have change that we are trying to lose. I think that this is much more a comment than anything else, I think, but that we can unite around values, and that the proposed idea of nationalism was a nationalism that unites around values rather than any sort of citizenship that we share, and that those values can be an aspiration, and those values can be something that links together our collective solidarity for a future that we want. And so the question that I would leave you with is, what would you say are the concessions that we make if we put class at the forefront of this struggle? And yeah, that's all I'll leave it.
Okay. Just very quick.
Go first.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm glad you said what you did, because one way of interpreting what's going on with identity in the country is the reverse of what I've been doing. To see it not as an expression of our individualism, but rather the search for attachment among people in a highly individualistic society. That's an interesting thought. Conservatives have raised this objection to me, and it's something I need to think about. And it's in some of these groups that you can develop that sense that we all have change to lose, right? But as soon as you're talking about common values, those values need to be rooted in something, right? For me to say we share the value, right? It's because we both recognize something, unless we have completely different reasons for believing in those values. And those common values is what I'm calling citizenship. So I wouldn't get hung up on the word. I'm saying that there is a category to which we all belong, that we're citizens of the United States. And I want to pack in the values that we share to give that a kind of robustness, so that when you're involved in one group that's working to loosen chains, people in another group will understand that, not because they've been taught it in church, but because they'll understand that this is a country where citizens stand up for each other. That's the idea.
You didn't articulate any of those values, I think is one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a short book. I'm saying that, no, but the conversation about the values is something that then begins. I have some thoughts. I only have a few thoughts. But what I want is for us to start talking in those terms and start packing that with meaning, so we can get something done together rather than just focusing on our differences and our grievances with each other.
Charles or Prerna, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
Well, I would just sort of repeat, I guess, one of the points that I was making in my response, and that is that it's not just a matter of trying to find values which we share with other people, but values which we share with other people as Americans, and values that we can understand our Americanness as consisting in. We can all think that we have a duty to stand by one another in the face of natural disasters, but that's going to lead me to care about the people in Barbuda and the British Virgin Islands as much as about the people in Puerto Rico or Florida. We need, if we're going to talk about a common vision for America, values that define us as Americans. And maybe they may be national values. I think, as I was suggesting, they have in the past been this image of American exceptionalism, but that seems to me what one would have to be looking for to flesh out this idea of citizenship. Not just values which would orient us toward all humanity, perhaps, but values that can circumscribe what it is important to us as Americans. Are there such values? I'm doubtful.
I'm going to respond to that because it's a common thread between both of their comments. I don't understand the point, I have to say, so I guess we would have to have another conversation to have it explained to me about American exceptionalism and nationalism. What distinguishes, to my mind, the United States is that it's not encumbered by a pre-democratic past. that other countries have something we do not have. And what distinguishes us is that. Now, the longer we're together, we do have a past. And a lot of it is about white dominance and all the rest. That's true. But you don't need to have, a brand that's distinguished from everyone else's if we're all in a market looking for places to land because we prefer what this country stands for rather than another. Because it lacked those common things, Americans have always thought of the country as a project, as a construction site. Other countries don't think of themselves that way. There is no Belgian project. There is no Sri Lankan project. Other things come with that. So the only thing that distinguishes us, in our minds at least, has been that we don't have that, and so we're always trying to do something together. And I think that's something you can appeal to give, because what we do share now is a history of trying to do that. And one can be proud of that. One can also be ashamed of the crimes that have been committed. Even admitting a crime and recognizing a common crime is a weird kind of, but genuine attachment. Look at Germany. Is the only thing holding Germany together today, I would say, is a sense of a shared problematic past. Yeah. So we would have to go farther into nationalism and what I have a sense that my interlocutors mean a lot more, and I haven't fully understood appreciated what they're trying to say.
You know what? Thank you. Again, we're short on time, and I hate to go over. I'm going to ask each of these two people who've been waiting patiently to ask their question, and then we can do one last wrap-up answer. So why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks a lot. My question involves the figure of, I'm not sure if is this working? Can you hear me? My question involves the figure of Bernie Sanders, who I think is a troubling figure for both Mark Lilla's analysis and for Charles Larmore's response. Sanders came close to clinching the Democratic nomination. He had a vision that was not identity-based, but he had the nomination stolen from him, according to at least several analysts, by the machinations of one of the two major parties that, according to Mark Lilla, form the institutional basis for political change. But the simple fact that he almost won the nomination, that without the Democratic Party he might have done, and very possibly the election, also, I think, challenges Charles Larmore's sense that such unifying narratives are no longer viable. Sanders had a unifying narrative. I don't think it was about values. I think it was about class, and I think it was perhaps providing something like the nationalist vision that Prerna was kind of gesturing towards. So I'm interested in what you make of the Sanders phenomenon.
Thank you. And let's get one more question over here.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. So I wanted to chart the conceptual space at play, because I think that there are two distinctions you could make that might ultimately help to advance your case. Like, one is that there's a distinction between pitching a message that's unifying and a message that's non-disjunctive, in the sense of like discreetly trying to appeal to discrete groups. And as I take it, you could sever your thesis as not being one in favor of a unifying message, because let's be honest, a unifying message won't work politically, right? If your message appeals to 80% of the population, an opposing party can always just pick a subset of that message plus tailor some other 60% of the population to win. And so instead of advocating for a unifying message, you should just advocate for non-disjunctive messages, right? And that, I think, gets to some of your criticism with relation to the problems that identity politics faces, and will also avoid Professor Singh's criticisms to some extent about the problematic roles that unification can play. Another response you can have in response...
Can I stop you for 1 second?
Oh, sorry.
And we only don't have much time.
Yeah, we need a question.
Give
here.
me an example of what a non-disjunctive message sounds like. Just one example, 6 words, whatever it would be.
So that would be, vote for me because I support X, instead of vote for me if you are A, I support X, and if you are B, I support Y, and if you are C, I support Z. So that would be, with your example on the Democratic webpage, right? I would just have one tab for what I stand for, and I wouldn't make discrete appeals to discrete groups. Okay, sorry, I guess I'll drop the second part of the question, but the question in essence would be to ask you whether this charting out this conceptual possibility would be something that you find, potentially desirable, and I think would save a number of the interesting theses in the book.
I'm trying to put that together with Bernie Sanders, so let's go ahead.
Can we really not stay later?
Well, I don't know. People willing to stay another 10 minutes? Okay, we'll get, because we have a few more questions
I'll
too.
eat really fast at dinner.
Okay, fine.
I'll take my
Good.
dinner home.
Okay, if people do though, I know people have families to get home to. If you have to go, please feel free. Go ahead.
Are we going to collect the questions?
Well, so let's collect. Let's collect 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a similar question to the question that was asked earlier, which is, why is it that we hesitate from filling this positive vision that everyone seems to agree is slightly underdeveloped with the classic principles of the liberal tradition: liberty, equality of opportunity, freedom from want, things like that? Why are we shirking from putting those on the table? And I think we could maybe even, I don't think your book was perhaps the place for this, but why, when we talk about this unifying vision, don't we put even more concrete things on the table in terms of policy? To me, the politician, and this is why it relates to the earlier question, the politician who probably best embodies this today is someone like Bernie Sanders, who talks about Medicare for all, which is exactly the kind of demand that could unite your South Side single mother in Chicago with maybe not the realtor in Mississippi, but a coal miner in West Virginia. So I wonder why, Professor Lilla, you shirk from putting those concrete sorts of things on the table. What's wrong with doing that?
And last question. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm wondering, I feel like a lot of what you say in terms of advocating for this separation between identity and politics, to be quite frank, I find it to be very troubling, and it personally bothers me, because I think that for marginalized communities in this country, policies like, for example, in my community, for the Muslim ban or the Muslim Brotherhood Designation Act, these policies have real and tangible effects on people in my community, and they translate into real and tangible violence. And I'm wondering to what extent you believe that what you're saying is emblematic of your own privileges as ostensibly a white man.
Okay, so here we go.
Okay, the P word has come up. Well, I'll just answer that you have to be it needs to be said in universities, unless you know someone well and their lives, you know nothing about them. You know nothing about what they've been through. You don't know their life experiences, and you cannot presume to judge anything about their privilege on the basis of a social category. That out of the way, you ask a great question. And give me an example now to explain what I'm talking about. Something like the Muslim ban is a great example of where, and Donald Trump's handling of it, where, in other words, where he's dissing Muslim Americans and dissing people whose children have fought for this country and died for this country, right? Why should that upset me? Should that upset me because I have a deep understanding of Muslim American life? I'm a busy guy, I might not have that. But he is dissing American citizens. They are being treated differently on the basis of their religion and the countries they come from, and that is outrageous. And if you have planted in people's minds 2 basic principles, which gets back to what we were talking about before, solidarity and equal protection under the law are the 2 things I mentioned in the book. I think just about every liberal cause can be put under one of those 2 categories. And this would be a case of equal protection under the laws and solidarity. That I have a stake as a citizen in the fact that people in your community and maybe even members of your family are not being treated equally in this country. And unless I think of you as a citizen and not just a person from a faraway place in another group, I'm not going to be moved. And so what I'm concerned with is building a kind of civic education where kids learn this in school, that you need, that by virtue of all Americans should matter to you. Now, you also need to understand them, just to understand the diversity of America. It makes you a smarter, richer person to learn. All of that is all good. But I need something to appeal to. And those two principles seem to work for me. And I think Bernie Sanders is appealing to those, because there has to be a principle behind class. You can't just say, I'm appealing to class. Well, okay, there are classes. Now motivate me to action. What motivates me to action is that if there are class disparities among Americans, I'm against it. If there are serious harms caused by class distinctions, I don't want my fellow citizens to experience that. And, it goes back to the 4 freedom speech of Roosevelt. Freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Doesn't get any better than that.
Any final remarks from our discussants?
Well, if I could make a very brief reply to the 2 questions that came from that direction. One of them was yours. But the other one was a person I don't yet see here anymore. Bernie Sanders, did he have a unifying message? Well, he had a unifying message for some people. But Medicare for All is, I doubt, a unifying message for all the residents of America. In other words, it is a message that addresses a we that is too narrow. Liberal principles, it goes to your question now, liberal principles in the abstract, well, of course, that's something that I would affirm, but that's also something we find institutionalized, instantiated in many, many other countries besides America. If that's around which we're going to construct our we, now the we's too big. The question is, it includes Canada.
Can you
France,
explain? Sorry, Chuck.
I thought that what we were looking for
Go ahead. No,
was a we that designates something that we as Americans distinctly share, all of us. And that's what I doubt the existence of.
Sorry, but isn't it possible that, and I think this is the case, that American thinks that they do have universal values that apply everywhere, which is more than questionable, but we just happen to be here, that's all. We don't need to distinguish ourselves as having a special brand, we just happen to be here.
So now we're really over time. So
Okay.
we're going to continue this conversation over dinner. I'm looking forward to it. And those of you who are going elsewhere for dinner, I hope you enjoy your dinner. And I want to, please join me in thanking Professor Lilla and our discussants.